If you had to wipe out an entire dangerous cult but only had one bullet, how would you do it? Well, that's exactly what Children of the Sun intends to answer, and as it turns out, it's by combining Superhot with Sniper Elite and a sprinkling of Carry the Film for good measure. The story follows a young cult member who gains telekinetic powers and decides to betray said cult after they kill their father. Cue gameplay. Each level starts with you surveying an area full of enemies. If you've played any Ubisoft game, this will feel pretty familiar as you tag your soon-to-be dead enemies for easier killing, and the game gives you a handy counter at the top of the screen to let you know how many people are on each map, as well as numbering each enemy you tag, so even if you can't initially find everyone, you know how to at least keep a lookout for hidden enemies and how many there are. Controls for this part of the game were a little strange. You could only move left and right, but instead of the WASD keys, you'd slide your mouse left and right to move. In fact, this entire game is played solely with the mouse on PC. But sometimes my character would just kind of slowly crawl left or right if the mouse wasn't perfectly centered. But most of your time isn't spent as a squishy human surveying, it's spent as the bullet mid-flight. Once all your targets are found, it's time to take aim and see the game's true hook. You only get one bullet per level, so you need to make use of your telekinetic powers to move the bullet through every single enemy on the map, killing them all in one clean shot. You do this by having the power to reorient the bullet's trajectory after each kill. You take your shot, get your kill, time then slows to a crawl, and you shoot once again, but this time from the position of your now dead enemy's head, turning it from a shooter to a puzzle game in one clean, devilishly clever idea. But because time only slows when you get a kill and returns to normal when you fire, aiming is still really important, and timing is even more important. You still need to lead your targets a bit. There was one level where enemies were driving around in cars. I had to first shoot one enemy as the car circled around them, then over to a second enemy, giving the car just enough time to come around some buildings and rocks, so I could position myself at the right time and place to get them. The game is full of things like that where just the positioning of enemies and their movement can dramatically change things. Kind of like puzzle pieces, because this game is more of a puzzle game than a shooter. Like, you don't tag enemies in order to determine threats like you do in most other games, because enemies here don't shoot back at you. Instead, you fail if you miss. You're doing it to help plan your inevitable path of destruction through the level instead, which is just really satisfying. Something I normally find just so mindless in other games suddenly becomes kind of exciting as I plot my path through the level, trying to figure out how I'm going to get around that corner or up and over that ledge onto the roof, and then finding enemies off in the distance that I can ping pong through and achieve exactly that, like puzzle pieces falling into place. And I like how the game even maintains your tags even if you fail and automatically tags enemies you shot, removing an awful lot of the tedium and allowing you to focus more on the puzzle elements of the game. You can't see the entire level at the start. Your movement is very limited, meaning you can only get a glimpse of the level from a few angles, and always at a distance. So sometimes you have to take a shot at an enemy and then survey your surroundings from there and hope you can find something else to shoot, and then seeing the top of dude's head or something and shooting that, both killing them while moving you to a new part of the map, which can both open up new options, showing you a part of the map you couldn't previously see, while closing off others. So each shot has to be carefully thought out. You have to plan ahead, because if you miss and hit a tree or your bullet sails harmlessly off into the sky, it's game over. But when your plan comes together, it's satisfying as hell, especially because each level is capped off with this cool sequence where you get a top-down view of the map and it plots out the path of your shot. And the game introduces new mechanics and enemies at a pretty steady clip for the first half-ish of the game, giving you enough time to orient yourself around them. There aren't a ton of mechanics or enemies to be fair, but that just means that each new mechanic and enemy type feels that much more important. Every time they introduce something new, it feels weighty and influences the rest of the game going forward, changing how you tackle every new encounter. You go from simply trying to figure out which order to shoot the guys in, to now having to curve your bullet around corners, use the environment, or ensuring you have enough distance for the bullet to speed up to pierce through enemy armor, and so on. And then the last half of the game takes all of these new enemies and abilities, mixes them up, and asks you to make use of everything you've learned just to complete the level, let alone go for a high score. A lot of games have plenty of enemy variety or lots of mechanics. Children of the Sun is far more limited, but it mixes and matches everything it has to create some pretty clever puzzles. It feels like it has more enemy variety than it does, because it makes such clever use of the limited amount that it does have, while mixing it with clever level design that teases your brain. Those levels start you off deep in the woods, picking off the odd small group of cultists here and there, but they quickly begin to escalate, taking you through streets and towns, buildings and railways, all while sprinkling in a touch of the supernatural to the level design as it goes on, allowing them to add more complexity to levels, everything from cars and explosives to floating objects to avoid. So because of all that, despite this technically being a slow, methodical puzzle game where you're spending most of your time stopping and looking around, it still feels tense and, well, I wouldn't say fast-paced, it does feel faster than you'd think, while giving you plenty of room to breathe and stop and think. The story is told through these comic book-like scenes that feel like you're reading a horror series. The rough, sketchy art style conveys the main character's manic, insane view of the world, and the quick, almost messy feeling editing gets across just how much they seem to hate these people that you're fighting. The game can be creepy, unnerving, and foreboding. It's not really true horror per se, it's not trying to scare you. It's more like horror themed, it has horror vibes to it. You're dealing with creepy cults controlling people, a mentally unstable main character brought to the edge of insanity from the trauma of the cult they grew up in, and that hint of the supernatural. And it's that little hint of the supernatural I really like, because when everything around you seems relatively normal, you're clearly in normal woods, fighting seemingly, albeit unhinged, normal people, it makes that little hint of the strange stand out all the more. It makes it feel that much more out of place and scary. When you get a kill, it doesn't make the sound you would think it would. It's not a satisfying crunch or a tick of the kill count going up. Instead, it's a distorted drum and cymbal echoing. It's strange and sells the weird and creepy vibe of the game. It's almost like the main character is celebrating the kill, but instead it's heavily tinged with this guilt and horror of what they've done. It gets a feeling of mixed emotions across, which is exactly what I think the main character is feeling. Even the bullet flying through the air doesn't feel celebratory or glorified. The almost staticky sound of it makes it feel tense and chaotic. It sounds stressful. It's akin to the sound of leading up to a jump scare or a particularly gruesome scene in a horror movie. The deep buzzing sound reflects the main character's chaotic mind, combined with the sketchy art style of the comic book cutscenes, and the almost dreamlike color scheme makes it feel like you're watching a nightmare play out. As much as I love the game though, it is short. It'll run you about 3 to 4 hours, with no real reason to replay unless you like going for high scores. But look, in my last video I reviewed a game called Pepper Grinder, and there I said it was short but sweet, and that if my only complaint about it was that I wanted more of it, that's still a pretty good game. I had the exact same feelings for Children of the Sun. I would much rather leave a game wanting more of it than leaving feeling overstuffed, bloated, and tired of it. It may not last long, but it's so good it's worth the $20 Canadian for what will probably be one of the most underrated indie darlings of the year.